Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the secretive, seductive world of Japanese courtesans women, who were far more than just entertainers. They were artists, elite companions, masters of intrigue, and sometimes survivors of unimaginable pressures. But one subject rarely discussed is what happened when these high-ranking courtesans got pregnant, from secret abortions to bizarre herbal remedies and even chilling rituals whispered about behind closed doors. Their methods were often as shocking as they were heartbreaking. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine being dressed in 12 layers of silk, so tight you can barely breathe, your hair styled with enough pins to conduct lightning, and your feet forced into wooden shoes so high one wrong step could land you in the next life. Welcome to the daily grind of Anne, a Edo period courtesan. Yoshiwara, the most famous red light district of old Tokyo, wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a stage, a fantasy world wrapped in incense, smoke, lantern glow, and heavy denial to the outside world. Courtesans were living art. They danced, they played shamisen, they recited poetry, but above all, they mastered the one talent society valued most: pretending everything was fine. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Behind the fans and flirtation, the courtesan's life was less Cinderella, more luxury hostage. These women were bought young, often sold by their families for a sack of rice and the vague promise of opportunity. They were trained like opera singers and gladiators combined. Make no mistake, they were elite, but they were also owned. Every step they took, every client they smiled at, every coin they earned belonged to someone else. Usually courtesans were products, investments, and pregnancies. Well, that was considered the ultimate product defect, because if there's one thing worse than losing money in business, it's having your best performing merchandise go out of service for 9 months. Now, in a perfect world, a courtesan might have taken time off for a baby shower, a sabbatical, maybe a quiet retreat with prenatal yoga and hot stone therapy. But this wasn't a perfect world. This was Yoshiwara, where the only stones were the ones you might be stoned with. If you broke contract, pregnancy didn't just mean losing work, it meant scandal. It meant punishment. It meant quite literally blood in the bathwater. So while the streets outside echoed with the clip-clop of platform shoes and sweet laughter, the inner chambers held darker. Truth, secrets whispered behind screens, remedies passed down not from healers, but from survivors. This was a world of velvet and iron, soft to the eye, brutal underneath. And for the courtesans living inside it, getting pregnant wasn't just a problem, it was a crisis wearing lipstick. If you've ever signed a contract without reading the fine print, congratulations, you've already shared something in common with an Edo-era courtesan, except in her case, the fine print included phrases like, "You will never own your life again." And oh, and by the way, don't get pregnant unless you enjoy pain, shame, and herbal poison. Courtesans didn't enter the industry with resumes and references. Most were sold into it as girls, sometimes as young as 7, by families who needed money or just didn't want another mouth to feed. It was the 1600s. Netflix wasn't around, so people tagged the kimono she wore debt, the hair oil debt, the lessons in poetry tea ceremony, and how to pretend you're thrilled by middle-aged men discussing rice taxes debt. By the time she was ready for clients, she already owed more money than a failed startup. Now they contract, and let's use that term lightly because she had no legal say in it. Was basically a glorified leash. It dictated when she slept, who she served, how she smiled, and most importantly, that her uterus remained strictly decorative. Pregnancy, that wasn't in the brochure. And let's not forget the clients, a diverse collection of drunk samurai, emotionally starved merchants, and the occasional poet who thought whispering about cherry blossoms counted as foreplay. These men weren't looking for long-term commitment. Most weren't even looking for eye contact, and if they got A courtesan pregnant, they disappeared faster than your paycheck after payday. Of course, the brothel didn't blame the man. That would be far too progressive. Instead, the woman, the walking investment, was accused of carelessness, as if she had simply tripped and fallen into an accidental third trimester. In some establishments, even the suspicion of pregnancy was enough to get a courtesan reassigned to the bottom, rung the clients with fewer teeth and more complaints, or worse, she'd be locked away until the problem resolved itself. You see, this wasn't just about sex. It was about control, reputation, and money, and babies were bad for business because nothing runs a romantic illusion faster than morning sickness. So what happens when a courtesan in Yoshiara does the one thing she's absolutely not supposed to do? No, not fall in love. That's frowned upon. But survivable, we were talking about the big ones. The moment her stomach starts growing for reasons other than bloat from too much fish soup pregnancy. The ultimate plot twist see in this elegant silk-wrapped prison getting pregnant wasn't a beautiful miracle. It was a career-ending biological betrayal in modern terms. It was like your iPhone accidentally deciding it wanted to be a toaster. Beautiful, maybe useful, not anymore. The courtesan's role was to entertain, seduce, and maintain the illusion that every client, no matter how hairy, drunk, or emotionally unstable, was her one true love, a baby that shattered the fantasy suddenly clients might remember that actions have consequences, and no one is paying premium rates to be reminded. They left their real family across town to the brothel. Pregnancy wasn't a matter of health. It was a product malfunction. A courtesan's value depended on her availability. If she is busy gestating a small human, she is not serving tea, singing songs, or flirting with men old enough to be her grandfather. That means she is not making money, which means the brothels is not making money, which means someone is going to be very, very angry. There were no sympathy cards, no congratulations on the new arrival banners, just a lot of whispering behind fans and the looming threat of being demoted from living artwork to unmarketable liability at best. She might be hidden away until the issue resolved itself, which, let's be honest, is a poetic way of saying handle it or else. At worst, she'd be thrown out penniless with a reputation so tarnished even the low-tier tea houses wouldn't touch her, and the baby let. Let's just say this wasn't exactly a culture built on maternity leave. Pregnancy in the courtesan world wasn't just forbidden, it was feared, because once it happened, everything changed. The own who was once the glittering centerpiece of the district became an unspoken warning to the others. A reminder cloaked in silence and shame that bringing life into the world might very well end your own. You'd think in a place like Yoshiwara, where secrets flowed more freely than, say, that a little thing like pregnancy might be handled with quiet sympathy and delicate discretion. Yeah, no, the moment Aortizon suspected she was pregnant, a ticking clock started in her head. Not toward motherhood, but toward ruin. And make no mistake, she was on her own. There were no best friends rushing over with comforting words and pickles. There were no spa days or maternity massages. There were just paper walls, fake smiles, and a whole lot of lying. Everything became a covert operation. Morning sickness. Blame it on bad shellfish fatigue. Just a little tired from dancing all night. Haha, Miss Cycle. Oh, you sweet summer child, do I never say that out loud. Beneath the surface level glamour of painted faces and elegant kimonos was a parallel world of whispers, hushed rituals, and quiet. Panic courtesans shared remedies in code passed down like haunted family recipes. Try the tea with 3 leaves, not 5 fives for head of chest, 3s for well, you know. Even the act of checking if you were pregnant had to be done in secret. Some girls became experts at reading their bodies, like they were decoding enemy messages. A missed period could mean anything: right stress diet, Mercury being in retrograde, or, as it was known in the Edo period, we pissed off another god again. And if you were certain that that's when the real performance began, you still had to work, still had to flirt, still had to endure being poured at by clients who definitely caused this in the first place without them ever suspecting a thing it was. Emotional espionage in high heels. Some courtesans even altered the way they walked to hide changes in their body. They tightened their OB belts just a little more, risk fainting rather than showing the slightest bump. Vanity, no survival. And of course, all of this had to be done while still being enchanting, because heaven forbid your emotional distress interrupt someone's evening of purchase romance. Beneath the layers of silk and powdered faces were women, quietly waging war against their own biology and against a world that demanded perfection but offered no grace, and it all had to stay hidden, because once the secret got out, the kimono was the only thing that could come undone. Let's talk tea, not the kind you sip while gossiping about your neighbor. A suspicious new kimono. Nufus tea had a very different purpose, one that came with cramping, bleeding, and the fate possibility of death. Welcome to the courtesan's secret weapon, herbal abortion brews, because when you couldn't exactly stroll into a pharmacy and ask for one discreet termination, please you turned to Mother Nature and hoped she was in a merciful mood. The most infamous players in this deadly tea party, mugwort, safflower, and kanzo, otherwise known as licorice root, which sounds innocent until you realize it was taken in horrifying doses that could make your uterus flip. A table these, or in your garden variety sleepy time teas, these were brewed like potions from a grim fairy. Tail steeped long, taken hot, and chugged down in desperate gulps, while praying to every god and ancestor you could remember. Did it work sometimes? Did it also destroy your insides, induce hallucinations, or give you a fever that felt like a preview of the afterlife? Also, yes. The recipes varied. Some were passed between courtesans like coded scrolls. Add ginger if you want it to act faster, one might say. Don't use too much safflower or your skin will start to burn. Another might whisper it was part science, part superstition, an entirely unregulated disaster. The worst part, you had to keep working the whole time. Imagine entertaining clients, smiling sweetly, making small talk about moonlight and cherry blossoms, all while bleeding in an alley end, hoping this was the cup that did the trick. And if the tea didn't work well, that just meant it was time to move on to the next method, because in this game there were no do-overs, just a terrifying ladder of solutions, each one darker than the last. For some, the herbal tea was enough. For others, it was just the opening act in a play titled Please Don't Let the Brothel Find Out. But the truth was clear. In the pleasure quarters, even something as innocent as tea could become a lethal gamble. And when your life is held together by silk smiles and secrets, one wrong sip could unravel everything. If the tea didn't work, and let's be honest, herbal roulette wasn't exactly foolproof, there was always another option, more hands-on. Enter the midwives, not the sweet smiling birth attendants you might imagine from folktales. No, these were women of shadows, ghosts in the alleyways of Yoshiwara. Legends passed between trembling lips. No signage, no appointments, no receipts, just pain, blood, and a whole lot of praying. They were called bazin, literally old women, and many of them had once been cottons themselves. Retired not by choice, but by the harsh reality of time, and with no savings, no pensions, and no market for gay-haired flirtation. They became specialists in fixing problems, unofficial ones. You didn't find them. You heard about them, a whispered name, a foldered note tucked in a sleeve. You They knocked on the right door at the wrong time of night and hoped you brought enough coin and enough courage. The tools, usually a mix of crude implements, boiling, watercloth rags, and whatever's lying around. Surgical steel sanitation, a concept for another century. No anesthesia, no after-air. Just grit your teeth and hope the gods are too busy to notice. And yet to desperate courtesans, these midwives were saviors, grim, sharp-fingered saviors who didn't ask questions and didn't tell lies. Payment wasn't always money. Some took hairpins, trinkets, or silk sashes. One story tells of a midwife who accepted a rare perfume bottle in exchange for silence, then wore it daily like a war medal. The risk, enormous infection, hemorrhaging, permanent infertility, or worse. Many girls never returned to the brothel. The official explanation: She caught a fever, the unofficial one. She caught reality with both hands and didn't survive it. If something went wrong, there was no legal recourse. After all, what could you tell the authorities? Hello, officer, I illegally sought an abortion. While working in a government-regulated sex district, could you please arrest me last? These midwives were the final stop before ruin or exile. No training, no ceremony, just candlelight, trembling hands, and the hope that today death wasn't charging full price. And somehow, even in this world of blood and fear, trust was forged between the broken and the ones who helped them. Break in silence. In most cultures, a hot bath is a symbol of peace, relaxation, a little self-care after a long day of pretending to like your job. But in the world of Edo period courtesans, a hot bath can mean something far more sinister and far more permanent. Welcome to the boiling bath method, a home remedy that promised to take care of the problem by turning your womb into a sauna from healthy idea. Was simple soak in a bath so hot your body would forcibly reject the pregnancy. Think of it as a spa day, designed by a sadistic herbalist with a grudge against reproductive health. The method was whispered about in hushed tones behind paper screens. Stay in until you feel dizzy, they'd say. If you faint, it as working medical advice at its finest. Some girls added special herbs to the water. Mugwort again, of course, because apparently that plant was the Swiss army knife of uterine sabotage others. Drank sake beforehand because why not combine internal poisoning with external overheating it? Was dangerous, extremely dangerous. You weren't just risking the pregnancy, you were risking your own life. Scalding burns, shock, heat, stroke. There are accounts of women fainting mid-bath and being dragged out unconscious, only to die quietly in some hidden room while the brothel continued its evening business. Nothing ruins a client's mood like stepping over a corpse on the way to his sack tray, and yet the method persisted because it was fast, cheap, and relatively discreet. No tools, no midwife, just water willpower and a very high pain tolerance. The courtesans were told to breathe through the pain, to stay calm, to keep quiet teeth in, while their bodies boiled from the inside out, all so the brothel wouldn't lose its best moneymaker, because nothing screams customer service like telling a girl to self-harm quietly in the back room. If the bath worked, the pregnancy ended. If it didn't, well, there were always darker options in a world where a baby could cost you your status, your contract, or your life, and your fatal bath wasn't extreme. It was just another Tuesday when herbal teas failed and boiling baths didn't quite do the trick. Courtesans turned to another time-honored technique in the ancient art of pretending everything's fine, tight, binding the idea. If you wrap your abdomen tightly enough, maybe, just maybe, you can squeeze the baby out of existence, or at the very least hide it long enough to avoid a scandal and a demotion to the drunk uncles and smelly merchants clientele tier. Enter stomach binding, known as Hirobi. It was basically a DIY. Womb corset, long strips of cloth were wrapped again and again around the lower torso until the courtesan resembled a very glamorous sushi roll, one holding in something she desperately didn't want to deliver. Of course, there were problems. Minor things like breathing and digestion and that pesky little issue of internal organ compression, but in the pleasure districts, comfort was always optional. Image was everything. Some courtesans bound themselves so tightly they could barely sit down, let alone dance, pour tea, or carry on a conversation about the beauty of the cherry blossoms, but they did it anyway because a visible pregnancy was social suicide, and in Yoshiwara, appearances weren't just maintained, they were enforced. The courtesans became experts at posture control, standing up straight. It wasn't about elegance, it was about keeping pressure on the womb. Slouching meant loosening the bind, loosening the bind meant discovery, discovery meant doom. Some even slept with the binding still on, as if constricting their midsection 24/7 would convince the fetus to rethink its life choices and quietly back out. It didn't, of course, and binding didn't stop the pregnancy at best. It delayed the reveal. At worst, it caused complications, ruptured tissues, dizziness, fainting, internal bleeding. But none of that mattered when the alternative was losing everything. You'd bled and smiled and danced to build. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't even about safety. It was about survival and illusion, because in the world of Japanese courtesans, the belly must remain flat, the smile serene, and the truth tightly wrapped beneath layers of silk and shame even. If what you're really hiding is heartbreak at some point, you have to admire the creativity, because when tease baths and body wrapping failed to correct the issue, courtesans sometimes turned to the most comforting thing available in any crisis food, and not just any food: rice balls soaked in sake, yes, fermented. Rice wrapped lovingly in cloth and consumed in hopes that it might dissolve an unwanted pregnancy like yesterday's gossip. The logic dubious, the desperation very real. Folklore whispered that vinegar, sika, and certain fermented foods had weakening effects on the womb. Courtesans were told by each other, by old servants, by the midwives with half an herb shop in their apron, that if you ate just the right combination of ingredients, you could wash the sea away. It sounds like a tragic fairy tale, and in many ways it was. The recipe varied by district in one brothel. The go-to method involved warm sake mixed with crushed garlic and pickled plum, which probably tasted like despair, with a hint of nausea. Another popular combo was rice balls marinated in vinegar, ginger, and shame, served cold, very cold. Did it work? You know the answer: not really, unless you count vomiting and intestinal distress as results. But in a world where your entire future hinged on hiding your condition, even a placebo with side effects was worth trying. Some courtesans were told to chant little verses while eating, part spiritual ritual, part emotional coping mechanism. Something along the lines of, return to the river, little child, for now is not your time. And then they'd swallow, trying not to gag. There's something incredibly human and heartbreakingly naive in this method. A kind of hopeful magic passed between trembling hands, because unlike the midwife or the boiling bath, this one felt gentler, almost like a ritual, almost like a prayer. But no amount of seka could rewrite biology, and while the rice balls offered comfort, they rarely offered results. Still, courtesans kept trying, because when your body isn't your own and your choices are limited to pain or secrecy, sometimes the only power you have left is believing in something, even if that something is a soggy rice ball soaked in old liquor and whispered regret. So let's say a courtesan gets pregnant. She's terrified, bleeding from herbal teas, possibly half poached from a boiling bath, and she's tried every rice ball in the folklore cookbook. Naturally, the next logical step might be to tell the father, "Ah, sweet child, that man is already gone." Courtesans didn't operate in a world where paternity was a shared responsibility. They operated in a fantasy one the client paid for, and the minute that fantasy tried to become reality, the man vanished like a samurai. In a scandal, most clients were married. Others were officials, nobles, or merchants with reputations they absolutely did not want associated with. Illegitimate children from the pleasure quarters. So when that quarter son nervously hinted there might be consequences, the reaction was almost universal. Sorry, I'm moving to Osaka permanently also. I don't know, you courtesans were trained not to expect loyalty. That's why any emotional attachment was considered dangerous, but still many women held on to a fragile hope that the man they saw week after week, who brought gifts and shared secrets, might do the right thing. He didn't. Even in rare cases where a client wanted to help, there were layers of legal and social barriers that made acknowledgement nearly impossible. Claiming the child meant scandal, scandal meant consequences, and for most adedo men, consequences were the one thing more terrifying than commitment. Some tried to leave money quietly, a few gold coins slipped to a brothel servant with instructions to take care of it. Others pretended they didn't recognize the woman at all. You have to understand, the courtesan was a fantasy, and fantasy doesn't get pregnant. So when reality knocked in the form of morning sickness, swelling feet, or a missed cycle, the men did what men have done in many chapters of history. They got really, really good At ghosting, the father's silence wasn't just literal, it was cultural, institutional, practically a tradition. No messages, no visits, no names on scrolls. Just another shadow in a world already thick with them, and for the courtesan, there was no time to grieve or rage. There was only the next performance, the next lie, and the silence growing in her womb. If pregnancy was a personal disaster, them letting the brothel find out that was the apocalypse, complete with dramatic consequences, zero sympathy, and absolutely no baby shower. You see, the brothel wasn't just your workplace. It was your world, your landlord, your agent, your stylist, your parole officer, all rolled into one. Unlike most institutions that cared deeply about profits and very little about people, it had one golden rule: don't get pregnant. So what happened when a courtesan slipped up? Well, it wasn't handled with sensitivity or a calm sit down with the boss. No, we're here to support you vibes, just a lot of side-eye passive aggressive fan snapping and the looming sense that you were about to be thrown under the gilded bus the moment the suspicion arose. Maybe you were walking a little slower, eating a little less, or just existing too carefully. The whispers began. First came the rumors. She's getting fat, she looks pale, she skipped her cycle. I heard it from the maid who empties the chamber pots. Then came the surveillance. Suddenly, you weren't allowed to leave the room alone. Your friends were asked to report on your activities. You were given less work, not out of compassion, but because they were prepping your replacement. And finally, if they were sure punishment, now this varied depending on the brothel's mood status and general appetite for cruelty that day. Some demoted the courtesan to the lowest ranks, forcing her to serve the roughest, drunkest, least hygienic clients imaginable. Others confined her to her room until she dealt with the issue. Some simply kicked her out. No money, no support, just a silk bundle of shame and a warning to others in more elite houses. There was the illusion of discretion. They'd claim she was on retreat or visiting family, but everyone knew what that meant. Pregnancy wasn't just a personal failing, it was a business risk, a contamination of the illusion, and in a system built entirely on fantasy, reality was considered rude. So when the brothel found out, there were no tears, no hugs, just cold calculations. And the slow, quiet eraser of a woman who broke the one rule everyone pretended wasn't already broken when you've tried every tea, choked down the vinegar rice balls, nearly boiled yourself like an overseas dumpling, and the brothel starting to look at you like a faulty lantern. You've got two options: confess and face the consequences, run like hell. And some courtesans chose exactly that. They disappeared in the districts. They were branded ninja jororo, runaway prostitutes, a term that translates roughly to she messed up the fantasy, now go fetch her back, because running away wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. You were property, and when property walks out the door with a baby on board, the brothel takes it personally. But that didn't stop them. Some courtesans fled in the dead of night, disguised in plain robes with their hair undone, abandoning their ornate identities. The way a snake sheds its skin, they slipped through alleyways, rode carts meant for laundry, or hid inside barrels. Yes, really barrels. It was dramatic, dangerous, and desperately cinematic. Where did they go? Anywhere. That didn't require perfume and pretending. A cousin's farm, a mountain shrine, a fishing village where no one asked questions. Unless you stole their safe places, where the name Yoshiwara didn't open doors, it closed them. Not everyone made it. Some were caught, dragged back, and punished publicly, both as a warning and a morale booster for the rest of the staff. Look what happens when you act like you have free will. Others disappeared so completely, they became urban legends. Did you hear about the Iran who ran off to become a nun? They say one lives in the hills now, reading fortunes and raising her child like a ghost. But running wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of cage, one where you traded makeup and money for silence and survival. And yet for many it was the only choice that still felt like a choice, because when your entire world is painted in rules and red lipstick, the Scariest thing isn't leaving, it's staying and pretending it didn't happen, so they ran not for revenge, not for rebellion, just for the smallest, most dangerous luxury of all, hope. Let's say a courtesan couldn't run, couldn't drink enough tea, couldn't fake enough smiles, and eventually the lie she was. Carrying became too big to hide beneath the silk. There was only one thing left to do: give birth quietly, invisibly, preferably, without anyone noticing. Welcome to the underground world of silent deliveries, where motherhood arrived in the dead of night, behind sliding paper doors, with towels stuffed in mouths to muffle screams. No birthing. Chairs, no midwives in cheerful aprons, no cries of joy. Just urgency, terror, and if you were lucky, someone who knew how to boil water without asking questions. Sometimes it happened in secret rooms, ones the brothel conveniently didn't know about. Other times it happened in storage closets, behind drapes, or even outdoors under cover of darkness, because nothing says beautiful miracle of life. Like squatting behind a bathhouse with a handkerchief in your teeth, the courtesan had to remain calm, because if she made too much noise, she wasn't just risking scandal, she was risking exile or worse, and there was no fanfare, no name-picking ceremony, just a bundle of blood and breath wrapped in a cloth and hidden before dawn. If she was very fortunate, a servant girl or an old retired courtesan might help. These were women who'd seen it all and kept their mouths shut tighter than a lacquered box. They brought towels, boiled water, whispered prayers, and never asked what would happen to the baby afterward. And the baby, well, that was the question no one wanted to answer. Some were taken away immediately. Others stayed hidden for a few days, tucked in a corner, fed in silence, loved with trembling hands. But everyone knew this was temporary. The child didn't belong here. There was no room in the pleasure quarters for innocence. What these women endured physically, emotionally, is almost unspeakable. But they did it because the alternative was worse. They gave birth. Like ghosts, then wiped their faces, fixed their hair, and returned to the brothel floor as if nothing had happened. No maternity leave, no postnatal care, just another performance, because in Yoshiwara, the show must go on. If a courtesan managed to give birth in secret, there was still one problem left: a tiny crying, impossibly fragile problem. And in the pleasure districts, babies weren't blessings. They were liabilities, with lungs loud, hungry, and impossible to explain to your next client. So what did she do? She walked under cover of night to the edge of town, to the roadside, to a place built for tragedy, a shrine of abandonment known as koya or jubasat sites. These were quiet stone shrines, tucked into the corners of society, halfway between a place of worship and a dumping ground. They weren't publicized, but everyone knew they existed, and everyone knew what they were. For a mother, often a courtesan, a servant, or any woman society had failed, would leave her infant on the steps, swaddled tightly, sometimes with a name, sometimes with nothing but a small charm or folded prayer paper tucked into the cloth. And then she walked away. No goodbye, no witness, no turning back. If she was lucky, a monk or a kind stranger might find the child. Sometimes a temple took them and raising them in silence. Other times they were passed to orphanages or into servitude, or simply vanished into the folds of forgotten stories. The courtesan didn't leave her child because she didn't care. She left it because there was no other path. The brothel wouldn't allow children. The law offered no protection. And even if she ran, what future could she offer a baby while hiding from bounty hunters with nothing but a comb and a bloodstained oba? So she did the unthinkable, not out of cruelty, but out of love. Twisted by desperation, some shrines were said to be haunted. Locals claimed they heard crying at night, not from the babies, but from the women who left them, echoes of regret carved into the wind like invisible gravestones. It wasn't just a shrine, it was an altar to every dream that never stood a chance. And the worst part, no one ever asked who left the child, because in the floating world of courtesans, everyone already knew. They just pretended not to. In the eyes of Japanese tradition, an unborn or aborted child isn't just a medical footnote, it's a spirit, and in the world of the courtesan, these spirits were everywhere. They were called Mizuko, literally water children, a poetic name for something profoundly heavy, the souls of children who were never born, or who were born and never raised, and no matter how silent the birth, how quiet the abandonment, these spirits didn't simply disappear. They lingered. Mizuko were believed to float between worlds, not fully in the realm of the living, yet not quite passed on either. In many ways, they mirrored the women who carried them. Courtesans, after all, also existed between realities, glamorous but enslaved, adored but discarded, present but unseen. And so a strange kinship formed, one ghost carrying another. Some women were haunted. Not just emotionally, but spiritually. It was said Mizuko could cause misfortune, illness, or nightmares if not properly honored, and the courtesans who had no freedom in life sought freedom for their unborn in death. That's where the Mizuko Kuyo came, in a secret ritual, a whispered apology, a kind of emotional exorcism, dressed in prayer beads and incense. The ceremony was small, sometimes held at a quiet temple outside the district, sometimes performed in private late at night with only a flickering lantern and trembling. Hands offerings were left: baby toys, flowers, little red bibs tied around Jizo. Statues, the Buddhist guardian of children, and travelers. Courtesans couldn't raise their children, but they could ask the gods to protect them. It was the only parental act they were allowed, and it was heartbreaking. Imagine lighting incense for the child you never got to name, whispering, "I'm sorry." Not because you didn't love them, but because you did in a world that didn't give you room to show it. Some came back again and again, year after year, unable to forget others. Visited once and never returned, too afraid to reopen the wound. But all of them carried it because even in a world built on forgetting some memories, refused to drown. Mizuko weren't just spirits. They were reminders that love existed, however briefly, even in the darkest corners of silk and shadow. In Yoshiwara, the pleasure district, was always loud laughter echoed down lantern-lit alleys. Music floated through the sliding doors. Perfumed clients shouted about love. They didn't mean. Courtesans giggled, poured sake, and told 100 lies an hour, all for the price of illusion. But beneath all that noise, something remained perfectly still. Silence, a specific, deliberate kind, the kind that wrapped itself around certain topics like a velvet chokehold, and at the center of that silence was the unwritten rule: we don't talk about pregnancy. Every courtesan carried an invisible weight: contracts, expectations, debt, desire. And for the ones who got pregnant, that weight tripled overnight. It pressed on their lungs, their decisions, their very skin. But somehow they kept dancing. They still performed, still laughed at jokes they'd heard 1,000 times, still painted their lips blood red and pretended they weren't bleeding somewhere else. Entirely because strength in Yoshiwara wasn't about force. It was about endurance, the ability to carry your pain like it was part of your costume, to cry only when your makeup was waterproof, to bind your womb, bind your heart, and keep serving tea, as if nothing inside you was unraveling. Some might say they were trapped, and they were, but even in the cage they found ways to sing. They learned to master control, not over their fate, but over how they wore it. They consoled each other with gestures instead of words. They protected secrets, not because they were ashamed, but because trust was rare and sacred. They taught younger girls the quiet codes: how to hide, how to lie convincingly, how to survive one more day in a world that profited from their obedience. They weren't fragile like glass. They were fragile like porcelain, beautiful, dangerous to mishandle, and capable of enduring centuries of pressure. No one wrote poems about that strength. There were no plays, no woodblock prints, only silence and survival. But if you looked closely in the tilt of the head, the narrowing of the eyes, the slight tremble in the hands, pouring tea, it was there. They Were artists, yes, but they were also warriors painted in rouge and wrapped in silk, and for those who carried the unbearable, the unborn, the forgotten, the shame, no one dared name the fact that they still stood at all. That was strength disguised as elegance, disguised as grace. But make no mistake, it was strength. They were never supposed to be remembered. Courtesans existed to be consumed, not known, admired, desired, painted, yes, but understood never. And once they faded from the spotlight, they were swept aside like yesterday's incense smoke, especially the ones who got pregnant. There were no statues for them, no poems carved in stone, no history books recording the names of the girls who bled quietly behind the screens, who left offerings for children. No one else ever saw who disappeared in the night with swollen bellies and broken contracts, but they existed and they mattered behind every fan flutter and practiced. Laugh was a human being surviving the impossible. They carried beauty like armor and shame like a shadow they were punished for wanting. Love exiled for making life and buried in the footnotes of history like an inconvenience. And yet they still found ways to fight, not with swords, not with speeches, but by enduring, by holding on to moments of kindness in a world designed to forget them, by protecting each other in small defiant ways. A whispered warning, a smuggled remedy, a silent prayer at a shrine that smelled of old moss and ghost. Stories remembering them isn't just about justice, it's about truth. It's about pulling back the silk and acknowledging what was really there all along, the heartbreak, the resilience, the quiet rage of women forced to choose between survival and self. They weren't weak, they weren't shameful, they were trapped in a system that commodified their bodies and criminalized their humanity. And still they endured. Some are honored only by the red bibs on weathered Jesus statues. Some are remembered in the aching melodies of old shamies and songs. Most are unnamed, unheard, and unseen. But tonight we remember them, not just the courtesans they were trained to be, but the mothers they were never allowed to become, the daughters sold too soon, the women who survived the unspoken war inside the brothel walls. They lived in the shadows, but that doesn't mean they should stay there. War, it didn't start with a bang. No, the moment that would transform the American West forever came quietly, as soft as the flow of the American River itself. It was January 24th, 1848. James W. Marshall, a carpenter overseeing the construction of a sawmill for a man named John Sutter, was inspecting the tail race, the ditch that allowed water to flow away from the wheel. The water was rushing a little too. Fast rocks had shifted the soil, needed clearing. Then he saw it, a flicker, a flash, a yellow gleam in the muddy shallows gold. He picked it up, rolled it between his fingers, bit it, because that's what people did in those days to check if wealth had actually arrived. He showed it to a colleague, then to Sutter, and Sutter, upon realizing what this meant, didn't cheer. He didn't celebrate. He panicked because Sutter had a dream, an empire of agriculture, peaceful, profitable, and utterly not filled with treasure hunters a gold rush would bring. Chaos, squatters, thieves, land disputes, and it did just not right away. You see, for a short moment they managed to keep it quiet, a secret fortune, a private revolution. That moment didn't last. Within weeks, whispers echoed across saloons and trading posts by spring sailors in San Francisco were abandoning their ships mid-voyage. Entire towns emptied. Overnight men ran from jobs, from homes, even from families, all chasing a riverborne dream. What began as a fluke on the edge of a sawmill would ignite the single largest mass migration in American history. Gold fever was airborne, and no one was immune. By the time word reached the East Coast and trickled across oceans to China, Chile, and Australia, it was too late. California was no longer just a distant frontier. It was an obsession, and all because one man saw a glimmer in the dirt. It wasn't the first time gold had been found in America, but it was the first time it rewrote the future overnight, because this wasn't just a discovery, it was a spark, and everything was about to catch fire. By the time 1849 arrived, California was no longer a distant rumor, it was a magnet, and the world was iron. Tens of thousands of people, mostly men, were on the move, from New York to New Orleans, from London to Lima, from Canton to Cape. When the rush had begun, they came on foot, by wagon, through blistering deserts and over ice-choked mountains. They came on ships that rounded the tip of South America, months at sea, just for the chance at a golden miracle. They were dreamers, desperate men, adventurers, crooks, widows in disguise. Entire ships were abandoned in San Francisco's bay, their crews running inland with shovels and gold pans. Some called it madness, others called it destiny. By the end of that single year, California's population exploded from barely 15,000 to over 90,000. San Francisco ballooned from a sleepy port to a wild, chaotic boom. Town streets were lined with tense gambling halls and hastily thrown together wooden shacks. The sound of hammers and pickaxes filled the air, competing with music. Shouting and gunfire. There were no banks, no law, no plumbing, just gold fever and the insanity that came with it. They called themselves the 49ers. Most arrived poor, sunburned, and covered in dust. They carried little more than blind hope and crude tools. Few had mining experience. Even fewer would strike it rich. But the dream was powerful enough to erase the odds. One man might dig for months and find nothing another could stumble upon. A sparkling nugget the size of a walnut, and suddenly be rich beyond imagination, at least, until he lost it all in a drunken poker game, and still they came. Every wagon that creaked westward carried more than tools. It carried ambition, desperation, and a fierce belief in reinvention, that out here, past the edge of everything, a man could become something new. 1849 wasn't just a year, it was a breaking point, and it reshaped not only California, but the very idea of America, a nation now obsessed with movement, with fortune, and with the myth that the next shovel full of dirt might change everything. When the gold came, the towns followed. Almost overnight, a miner struck it rich near a stream where it got out, and suddenly hundreds of tents popped up like mushrooms after a storm. Within weeks, the tents turned to timber shacks. A saloon opened, then 2, then 10. A blacksmith arrived, maybe a newspaper, a gambling hall, and just like that, a town was born. They called them boom towns because they didn't grow, they exploded. Places like Hangtown, Whiskey Town, and Rough and Ready weren't built on urban planning. They were built on adrenaline and blind hope. There were no mayors, no laws, no sidewalks, just mud, whiskey, and a hole. A lot of men with pickaxes and short tempers by day. These men clawed at the hillsides and panned the icy rivers by night. They drank, gambled, fought, and made terrible decisions in candlelit saloons. Fortunes could be won with one lucky swing of a pick and lost in a single hand of poker. There were no rules, or rather, there were 2. Many made up on the spot and enforced by whoever had the biggest gun or the loudest voice. Justice was improvised. Courtrooms were rare. Lynch mobs were not. But it wasn't just lawlessness, it was loneliness too. The population was overwhelmingly male. For every woman, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds of men. Letters from the East spoke of homesickness, heartbreak, and men crying quietly by campfires. The gold wasn't always in the ground. Sometimes it was just a memory of what they left behind. Some towns flourished for a time. San Francisco transformed from a sleepy harbor to a rowdy, bustling gateway to the gold fields, but many others didn't last. When the gold dried up, the people vanished. What was once a buzzing boom town became a ghost town. Buildings left to rot. Saloons still stocked with broken glasses, wind whispering through empty jail cells. The gold rush didn't just create towns, it devoured them. For every success story, there were hundreds of shattered dreams buried beneath muddy floors and abandoned tools. But no one came west expecting guarantees. They came for a chance, and boom towns, chaotic, filthy, and burning with hope, where that chance lived for a little while. Gold fever sounds romantic until you're knee-deep in freezing river water, swinging a pickaxe into rocks, sleeping on dirt, and calling Beans your only friend, the life of a prospector, wasn't glamorous. It was hard, lonely, and often miserable, but still they came because the promise of riches, even the slimmest chance of it, made. Men do impossible things. Most arrived with little more than hope, and a few essentials: a pickaxe, a shovel, a gold pan, and maybe a tin plate or two if you had money. You might splurge on a rocker box, a wooden contraption that let you sift through more dirt at once if you really had cash. A long Tom Sal, if not, it was all down to your two hands, and gravity and patience, panning for gold, meant hours spent over a river swirling sediment. Hoping to catch a flicker of yellow among the rocks, some struck it rich in a day, most didn't. They dug holes, moved boulders, built flumes, dammed creeks, and chased every rumor of easy gold like moths to flame. They slept in tents if they were lucky, open skies if they weren't. Rain meant wet clothes, snow meant frozen boots. Bears were a risk. So were thieves. Disease was constant: dysentery, scurvy, cholera, because sanitation was non-existent and miners weren't exactly washing their hands before meals. Food was basic, and expensive eggs could cost more than a day's wages. Beans, bacon, and coffee made up the holy trinity of miner cuisine. Vegetables, rare, bathing optional. Haircuts, forget it, and still they stayed because the gold was real. People had found it, and if they could, maybe you could too. That was the sickness of it. Every back-breaking failure still carried the hope that the next shovel of dirt might change everything, so they dug day after day, year after year. Some never found more than dust. Others found enough to change their lives, or at least buy one hot bath and a better pair of boots. But success wasn't the only test. Tenacity was, and in the muddy chaos of the gold fields, that was sometimes the only thing separating the legends from the lost gold. Didn't just come out of the earth, it came with a price tag, written in blood, sweat, and broken promises for all the stories of overnight fortunes. The truth was far grittier. Most miners didn't get rich. Some found just enough to survive. Many left poorer than they arrived, carrying nothing home but blisters and regret. But the cost wasn't just personal, it was national. California was never empty, though. The gold rush mythology would have you believe otherwise. Long before the miners came, the land was home to hundreds of thousands of Native Americans living across dozens of nations and tribes. But once gold was discovered, they were treated as little more than an obstacle between ambition and profit. As miners poured and native lands were seized, poisoned, and burned, rivers once full of salmon were clogged with debris, and mercury forests were cut down. Wildlife vanished, and the people, they were pushed out, hunted, enslaved, killed. The California state government even funded militias to clear the land, paying bounties for native scalps. By 1870, California's native population had plummeted by over 80%. What began as a rush for gold became a quiet genocide. But native tribes weren't the only ones who paid. Mexican and Chilean miners who'd been working California's hills long before 1849 were soon targeted by racist laws and mobs. Chinese immigrants who arrived in waves, hoping to earn a better life, were taxed heavily and driven out of claims by violence. Black miners, both free and enslaved, faced legal and physical threats every step of the way. Even white miners fought among themselves. Claims were stolen, camps erupted in gunfire. Fortune created friction, and everyone believed they deserved the prize. Gold brought chaos, it twisted morals, it rewrote values. Men who once believed in family law and church found themselves bribing, lying, stealing, sometimes killing, all for a glint in a pan. Because once you saw gold, really saw it, your soul never quite looked the same again. The gold rush wasn't just an event, it was a fever, a transformation, and for every ounce pulled from the ground, something else was buried deeper: justice, peace, community, or conscience. Gold may have glinted in the rivers, but justice, that was a little harder to find. In the early days of the California gold rush, there were no real laws. California wasn't even a state yet. It was a lawless, rapidly changing frontier where a man's wealth or the size of his revolver often decided right from wrong. And so the Miners made up their own rules. They formed what were called mining codes, loose agreements about claim sizes, boundaries, and behavior. If someone broke the rules, they were brought before a jury of their muddy, exhausted peers, but fairness was relative. He stole my shovel, might get you a warning. He found a nugget on my land. Might get you hanged, yes, hanged vigilante. Justice became the norm. There weren't enough sheriffs, so towns formed vigilance committees. These were self-appointed enforcers, quick to punish and rarely interested in trials. Suspects could be whipped run out of town or tied to a tree with a rope around their neck, often without evidence, and saloons. They weren't just places to drink. They were courtrooms, gambling halls, and sometimes execution grounds. A drunken insult could escalate into a shootout, a lost card. Game might end in murder, gunsmoke, and lawlessness danced side by side beneath swinging lanterns. Theft was rampant claim, jumping when someone tried to take over another man's land could sparkle out war between rival camps. Property lines were often decided with fists, bullets, or hastily scribbled signs nailed to trees. But amidst the chaos, something strange happened. Communities began to emerge. Makeshift governments formed. Real sheriffs were elected. Towns started building curses instead of gallows. California drafted a constitution in 1849 even. Before it officially became a state in 1850, the Wild West began to tame itself slowly, violently, unevenly, but the scars of that early lawlessness never quite healed because in the gold fields, justice had always been improvised, and even when the rolls arrived, they came too late, for many buried beneath the hills, forgotten in dry creek beds, or swinging from tree branches that once doubled as judges. The California Gold Rush wasn't just an American story, it was a worldwide alarm bell, and it rang loud. By 1850, ships from every continent were docking in San Francisco Bay, their sails heavy with wind, their decks heavy with dreamers. Gold fever had gone global, and California wasn't just a place, it was an idea. They came from Chile seasoned miners who had worked South America's gold fields long before the discovery at Sutter's Mill. They came from Peru, Mexico, and the West Indies, bringing skills, spices, and music from China. Thousands crossed the Pacific in wooden boats, driven by famine, poverty, and the promise of Gold Mountain. Europe sent its share. 2 Irish Germans, Italians, and Frenchmen, many escaping revolution, poverty, or war. Even a handful of Australians showed up, having chased their own gold, and figured they'd try again on another continent. California became a swirling, churning, multilingual chaos. Tents pitched side by side, arguments shouted in a dozen dialects, cooking fires filling the hills with scents from 5 different continents. At first it seemed like something beautiful, a global gathering, all drawn by the same dream, but dreams have borders. And when gold was scarce, prejudice grew fast. Foreign miners were often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. Their success was resented, their accents mocked. Laws like the foreign miners' tax were introduced, targeting non-American miners with steep fees and harassment. Chinese miners were especially vulnerable. They were driven from claims, beaten, sometimes killed, while officials looked the other way. Spanish peace-making miners, even those born in California, faced legal discrimination and mob violence. Racism wasn't just casual, it was policy. Still, many stayed. They built communities, temples, churches, and businesses. San Francisco's Chinatown took root. Latino towns thrived along old Spanish land grants. And even as they were pushed to the margins, these global pioneers helped shape the future of California and its food, its language, its spirit. The gold rush didn't just bring people west, it brought the world west. And for better or worse, it showed what happened when cultures collided, not over ideals, but over gold. Gold has a way of running out, even when the fever doesn't. By the mid-1850s, the rivers were quieter. The easy gold, the glittering flakes and nuggets that could be scooped from shallow stream beds, was gone. What remained was deeper, harder to reach, and required tools that most miners couldn't afford. The rush was over those who came expecting instant wealth. Now faced a cruel truth the gold rush had never been. A promise only a gamble, and for most, the house had won some stayed. Switching from panning to wage labor in large mining operations, these industrial outfits used hydraulic mining, massive jets of water, blasting entire hillsides apart to extract the precious metal. It was faster, more efficient, and devastating landscapes were shredded. Rivers clogged with debris and mercury farmland downstream was ruined. The gold might have still been flowing, but it came at a terrible cost, and lawsuits would eventually bring hydraulic mining to a halt decades later. Meanwhile, many of the original 49ers packed up and left broken by exhaustion, illness, or simple disappointment. Some returned home. Pockets empty, others drifted into new frontiers, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, chasing the next rumor, the next miracle, and a few stayed. They became shopkeepers, ranchers, teachers, mayors. They built California, not with shovels, but with roots, because while the gold was drying up, something else had taken hold. Possibility. California had transformed. It was no longer a forgotten territory. It had roads, ports, towns, newspapers, banks, and finally, statehood in 1850, just 2 years after Marshall's discovery. California officially joined the Union. The gold rush was over, but its impact was irreversible. It had redrawn the map. It had filled the West with people, ambition, and violence. It had shattered indigenous populations, transformed the economy, and turned a sleepy frontier into a symbol of American reinvention. What began with a sparkle in a river ended with an empire in motion. And while the miners moved on, California stayed gold, not just in its hills, but in its legend, because sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you dig up, it's what you build after the digging ends. The gold rush ended, but its echo never stopped. Even today, nearly 2 centuries later, California still wears the gold rush like a second skin. It's nicknamed the Golden State. Its motto, Eureka, I have found it. It's not subtle. This wasn't just a historical event. It became a national identity, a cultural myth baked into America's DNA, because the gold rush wasn't just about gold. It was about reinvention. It taught a young, hungry nation that fortune wasn't inherited. It could be chased. Doug fought for that. You didn't need a noble name, just a shovel and a little madness. It was the beginning of the American dream. As we now know, it moved fast, take risks, stake your claim, but the legacy is complicated. Yes, it brought rapid growth, innovation, and the birth of the modern West. It gave rise to San Francisco, to the railroad, to California as a cultural and economic giant, but it also left scars, deep ones. Native communities were nearly erased. Landscapes were ravaged. Racist laws created lasting wounds. Chinese laborers, Mexican miners, black pioneers, they built California too, but their stories were buried under the glittering myth of the white prospector with the lucky pan, and yet people still come not for gold, perhaps, but for something like it, for tech, for fame, for reinvention. Silicon Valley isn't far from Sutter's Mill. The tools have changed from pickaxes to code, but the hunger, it's the same. That's the real legacy, the belief that somewhere just over the horizon, with enough guts and luck, everything can change. The gold rush wasn't just a rush for metal, it was a collision of cultures, of ambitions, of illusions. It revealed the best and worst of human nature in the span of a single decade, and it turned one accidental discovery into one of the most transformational chapters in American history. The gold is mostly gone now, but the dream it sparked still digging. Helen Adams Keller was born on June 27th, 1880, in Tuscambia, Alabama, a place of green fields, cotton farms, and southern sun. Her parents, Arthur and Kate Keller, were thrilled. She was healthy, beautiful, and curious, with bright blue eyes and a soft, eager laugh for the first 19 months of her life. Helen was just like any other child. She learned to crawl, to babble, to smile at her mother's face and chase shadows across the porch. She loved the family dog, the garden, the wind. Her world was full of sound and color until suddenly it wasn't in. February 1882, Helen was struck by a mysterious illness. Some said scarlet fever, others believed it was meningitis. Doctors didn't know. All anyone could do was wait. For days she burned with fever, her body trembled. Her mother hovered terrified, and then it broke. The fever passed. Helen survived, but the cost was staggering. She could no longer see, no longer hear. The world had turned dark and silent, as if the illness had slammed a door shut, sealing her inside her own body. She was not yet 2 years old at first. Her family hoped it was temporary. Maybe she was just recovering slowly. Maybe her eyes would adjust. Maybe she'd respond to a sound, a voice, a bell, a dog's bark. But time passed, and it became clear Helen had been cut off from the senses that connect us to the world now. Imagine this: a toddler filled with energy and intelligence, suddenly unable to understand the faces smiling at her, the arms reaching for her, the voices calling her name. She had no language, no symbols, no way to express what she wanted or what she feared. Frustration filled the silence. Rage followed. She learned to mimic actions, to open doors, to nod or shake her head, but not meaning. Her world was texture, vibration, smell, and inside her a storm. Brewed by the age of 5, Helen Keller was described as a wild child, intelligent, strong-willed, and completely unmanageable. She would scream, kick, and even hit those around her, not out of cruelty, but desperation. She was locked inside her own mind, and no one knew how to reach her, not yet. By the time Helen Keller was 5 years old, the cheerful toddler who once played in the garden had become something else entirely. Untamed. Imagine being locked in total darkness, no sound, no sight, no language, just raw sensation and confusion. For Helen, life had become a blur of textures and instincts. She had no words to express hunger or fear, no way to understand comfort or discipline. So she lashed out. She threw tantrums, kicked furniture, ripped buttons off clothes, and slapped her baby sister out of jealousy. Her meals became battlegrounds. She ate with her hands, grabbed food from others' plates, and screamed when anyone tried to correct her. Her moods could swing from laughter to rage without warning. The Kellers didn't know what to do. Their daughter was intelligent, that much was obvious. She had figured out routines, learned how to open doors, unlock cabinets, even mimic household tasks, but her intelligence made her defiance more dangerous. Her parents were exhausted. Relatives whispered that she belonged in an asylum. Her mother, Kate, refused to give up. She began writing letters, searching for help, not just from doctors, but from anyone who might know how to reach a child like Helen. The trail led them to Alexander Graham Bell, who, aside from inventing the telephone, was also deeply involved in education for the deaf. Bell didn't have the solution, but he had a suggestion. He pointed them toward a school in Boston, the Perkins Institute for the Blind, and at that school, a young woman was recommended to travel south and meet the Kellers. Her name was Anne Sullivan. She was just 20 years old, visually impaired herself, poor, fiercely determined, and completely unprepared for the storm she was about to walk into. When Anne arrived in Alabama in March 1887, she was greeted by a bright, beautiful child, uncombed hair, wild eyes, a mischievous grin, and a scream that could shatter windows. Helen Keller wasn't cruel. She was trapped. The world had shut its doors, and she was pounding on them with everything she had. Anne Sullivan had one job: open the door. And nothing, not rage, not silence, not blindness, was going to stop her from trying. March 1887, to Scumbia, Alabama, a young woman named Anne Sullivan had arrived, determined to teach the unteachable. She moved into a small cottage on the Keller property, taking Helen away from the main house, away from indulgence, distraction, and pity. Anne's method was radical structure, discipline, and above all, language. But how do you teach language to a child who doesn't hear words or see letters? Anne began by spelling them into Helen's hand, one letter at a time, using the manual alphabet used by the deaf. DOL. She would sign into Helen's palm as she handed her a doll. Helen copied the movements. She was smart, curious, but to her it was just finger play motions with no meaning. She could mimic 100 signs and still not grasp that things had names. Anne was relentless. She spelled the names of everything. Helen touched cake mug spoon, water bread key, but the child didn't connect them. There was no concept, yet no understanding that the shapes in her palm represented the world around her. Then came April 5th, 1887, a day etched into history. Anne took Helen to the water pump outside. In one hand she placed Helen's fingers under the flow of cool water. With the other she spelled into her palm. W again and again, water, splashing fingers, moving WATR. Suddenly, Helen froze. The chaos inside her calmed her face, lit up with wonder. She dropped the mug. She touched the ground. Anne spelled earth. She touched the pump. Anne spelled pump. She touched Anne's dress, her face, her own hand. She had gotten it. For the first time in her life, Helen Keller understood that everything had a name and that words could be touched. Felt learned that single moment shattered the walls that had imprisoned her since infancy. A door had opened, and Helen, once locked in silent darkness, had found her. Way through by nightfall, she had learned 30 words. She would go on to learn thousands, but that was the moment the silence broke and the world, for the first time, had meaning. Once Helen understood that words had meaning, there was no going back. The door had opened, and now she wanted to run through it. Her mind, starved for years, devoured everything. Anne offered nouns, verbs, adjectives. She wanted to name the entire world, every object, every sensation, every emotion. Nothing was too small, too abstract, too complex. Anne could barely keep up. She taught Helen using real-world experience. They walked through gardens, touched flowers, leaves, bark, soil. Helen learned the word flower by feeling a rose tree, by hugging its trunk storm, by standing in the rain. And she didn't just want to know what things were. She wanted to know why they were. She asked deep philosophical questions. What is love? Where does the sun go at night? Why do people cry? This wasn't memorization. It was awakening. She also began to understand manners and morality, not just yes and no, but right and wrong. Anne spelled stories into her hand, biblical parables, Aesop's fables, poems, fairy tales. Through these, Helen learned about kindness, selfishness, generosity. Justice. Language wasn't just power, it was freedom. Helen even began writing her first simple sentences, using a special slate with raised lines. Each word she spelled made her feel more human, more seen. The frustration that had once driven her to scream and break things had transformed into purpose, but none of this happened by accident. Anne Sullivan worked tirelessly, often 16 hours a day, to unlock Helen's potential. She wasn't just a teacher, she was translator, mentor, protector, best friend. The bond between them was deeper than family, closer than blood. Anne had once called herself half-blind and unwanted. Now she was shaping one of the most remarkable minds in history, and the world began to notice. Newspapers started publishing stories about the miracle child in Alabama, the deaf-blind girl who was now reading, writing, learning faster than anyone believed possible. Helen's hunger wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was just getting started, because now that she had a voice, even if it came through fingers, she wanted to speak to everyone. And one day soon she would. By the age of 10, Helen Keller had already defied expectations. She could read Braille, write full sentences, and communicate rapidly through finger spelling. She devoured books, memorized poems, and debated complex ideas with her teacher. But it wasn't enough. Helen didn't just want to communicate. She wanted to speak. The idea seemed absurd. She was both deaf and blind. How could she possibly learn to form words she had never heard, shaped by sounds she had never experienced? But Helen wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for instruction. So in 1890, her family sent her to the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in Boston. There she met Sarah Fuller, a dedicated speech teacher who agreed to try the impossible. The method was Tactile Helen placed her fingers on Sarah's lips, cheeks, and throat. As she spoke, she felt the vibration of sounds, the shape of the mouth, the movement of the tongue. Then slowly, painfully, she began to mimic them letter by letter, word by word. She practiced endlessly, forming syllables in front of mirrors, feeling her own face, repeating each sound dozens of times. Her first word was, and next came is, I have small steps, giant courage. It wasn't easy. Her voice was difficult to understand at first. Even those closest to her struggled to make out her words. But Helen kept going because to her, speech was freedom on another level, a bridge to the world she had never truly entered, and every day her pronunciation improved and was by her side through every attempt, encouraging, correcting, celebrating together. They turned what seemed like a miracle into a method. By 12, Helen could speak full sentences. With time, she would learn to give speeches, recite poetry, even engage in lively conversation, though most people still needed an interpreter to understand her clearly. But that didn't matter because Helen Keller had done what even optimists thought impossible. She gave sound to silence. She had no memory of hearing her own voice, and yet she had created one with breath muscle and pure defiance. She had found her voice, and she would spend the rest of her life using it. By her mid-teens, Helen Keller had already achieved more than most people expected in a lifetime, but she wasn't content with being a miracle. She wanted to be educated truly, formally, completely, so she set her sights on something. No deafblind person had ever attempted college. The decision stunned people. Some admired it, others mocked it, but Helen didn't care. She enrolled at the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, a prep school for women aspiring to attend Radcliffe College, the sister school to Harvard. It was grueling. Anne Sullivan attended every class with her spelling entire lectures into Helen's hand, letter by letter, hour after hour. Imagine taking notes when you can't see the blackboard, can't hear the professor, and must absorb every word through touch. Every textbook had to be transcribed into Braille. Every test dictated word by painstaking word. Helen studied Latin, French, algebra, geometry, philosophy, history, literature. Her days were long, her nights even longer. She often went to bed with sore hands and a spinning mind. There were moments of pure frustration, tears, exhaustion, even doubt, but she never gave up. She was accepted into Radcliffe College in 1900. Suddenly, she wasn't just a student. She was a symbol. Newspapers followed her story. Photographers tried to capture her studying, reading, writing. People wanted to see the blind girl with a mind, but Helen didn't want to be a spectacle. She wanted to learn, not as a novelty, but as an equal. At Radcliffe, she continued her intense studies, even as administrators remained skeptical. Some professors doubted her intelligence, others found Anne Sullivan's constant presence distracting, but Helen pressed on proving her intellect over and over. In 1904, at age 24, Helen Keller graduated cum laude from Radcliffe College, the first deaf-blind person in the world to earn a college degree. She had taken on academia without sight or sound and won, but it wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a public declaration that disability did not mean inability, that the human spirit given a chance could outshine every limitation, and Helen was just getting started. Now educated, articulate, and ready to change the world, she turned toward a new battlefield. Activism. Helen Keller could not hear a crowd cheer or see her name in print, but she could feel injustice, and she refused to be silent about it. With her education complete, Helen stepped into a new role, not as a student, but as a fighter, a voice for the unheard, a symbol for those the world ignored. She became a fierce advocate for the blind and the deaf, but she didn't stop there. Helen took on poverty, women's suffrage, racism, child labor, and workers' rights. She criticized powerful corporations, supported birth control, and even spoke out against war. People expected a quiet, delicate woman. What they got was a political firestorm. She joined the Socialist Party in 1909, arguing that capitalism was crushing the poor while the rich prospered. This shocked many of her admirers, people who were comfortable applauding her triumph over disability, but weren't ready for her to challenge their bank accounts. When someone accused her of being misled, she replied, "It is true that I am blind and deaf, but I am not blind to social injustice nor deaf to the cries of the suffering." She gave lectures around the country, sometimes with Anne Sullivan beside her interpreting her words. She met world leaders, presidents, authors, and revolutionaries. She was blunt, brilliant, and impossible to dismiss. She campaigned for the American Foundation for the Blind, helping to raise awareness and funding across the nation. She testified before Congress, lobbied for Braille books in libraries, and championed equal education for the disabled. And she wrote books, essays, columns, letters. Her pen was a sword, and she wielded it without fear in the public eye. She was a paradox. A woman who couldn't see or hear, but who saw more clearly than most, and who spoke more powerfully than those with perfect voices. She demanded dignity, not just for herself, but for the marginalized, the voiceless, the forgotten. And though many disagreed with her politics, no one could ignore her. Presence Helen Keller had once lived in a world without words. Now, her words were changing the world. As Helen Keller grew older, the world grew louder in its admiration. She had become a global icon, a symbol of courage, intellect, and boundless will. From Tokyo to Cairo, from Washington to Moscow, her name meant something powerful: hope. She traveled the world, over 35 countries, advocating for the blind and the disabled. Crowds gathered just to see her walk onto a stage. Heads of state bent to shake her hand. Children reached for her, eyes wide as if touching her might pass on some of her fire. And yet, behind the applause, there was always Shadow Anne Sullivan, her companion, teacher, and best friend. Began to lose her health in the 1920s. For decades, they had been inseparable, two souls fused by struggle and love. But in 1936, Anne passed away. Helen was devastated. She had known darkness, she had known silence, but the silence left by. Anne's absence was different. It was deeper, and still she continued. She found support in Polly Thompson, who became her new interpreter and companion. Together, they continued the mission. Public speaking, fundraising, lobbying, writing. Helen didn't slow down, not even in her 70s. In 1948, she toured Japan after World War II, meeting wounded soldiers, children in ruined schools, and people who had lost everything. Her presence gave them more than comfort. It gave them a glimpse of what survival looked like when everything else had failed. She received dozens of honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of America's highest civilian awards. Universities gave her honorary degrees. Foundations were named in her honor books, and films told her story. But Helen didn't care for trophies. She cared that blind children had books, that deaf adults had jobs, that people who once felt invisible now felt seen. Even as her own health declined in her final years, she continued to write letters, dictate messages, and support causes she believed in. She once said, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it." She had lived both sides of that sentence, and through it all, she remained fully, fiercely herself. On June 1st, 1968, at the age of 87, Helen Keller passed away in her sleep. She died peacefully in her home in Connecticut, a woman once locked in silence and darkness, now mourned across the world by presidents, poets, activists, and everyday people who had never even met her, but death could not silence. Her Helen had become more than a person. She had become a force, a symbol of what the human spirit could do when handed the worst and still daring to rise, born into a world that offered her nothing. No sight, no sound, no voice. She created a life that left nothing untouched. She helped rewrite how people viewed disability. She shattered the idea that blindness meant helplessness or that deafness meant ignorance. She proved that communication isn't limited to ears or eyes. It comes from the soul. She wrote 14 books, gave hundreds of speeches, and met every U.S. president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson. She changed laws, she changed institutions, but most of all, she changed minds. Her life wasn't easy, and she never pretended otherwise. She faced illness, rejection, grief, and public criticism, but she never let those things define her. Instead, she defined herself loudly. She once said, "I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something." And what she did was reshape history today. Schools bear her name, statues stand in her honor, her books are still read, her quotes still passed between people in need of strength. And in moments when life feels too heavy, when silence seems too loud, when darkness seems to stretch endlessly, her legacy reminds us there is always a way through. You may not see it, you may not hear it, but you can be it. Helen Keller never saw sunrise, she never heard applause, but she taught the world how to listen, and that's a voice that never fades. Long before runways and designer tags, fashion began where civilization did, with sunlight, sand, and the struggle to survive in ancient Egypt. Fashion wasn't just practical, it was sacred, with the Nile as their mirror and the desert as their backdrop. Egyptians draped themselves in linen, light, breathable, and born from the flaxes that grew along the riverbanks. But it wasn't just about beating the heat. Clothes were spiritual, symbolic. Pharaohs wore finely pleated kilts, golden petrels, and intricate collars encrusted with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise. Every color meant something: white for purity, green for fertility, blue for the gods. The more detailed the weave, the more divine your status. Even children went unclothed until puberty, their innocence worn openly, while the elite were wrapped like living statues, their garments reflecting order and cosmic balance across the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. Fashion served a similar dual-purpose: protection and prestige. Men wore woolen skirts tied with belts. Women wore layered robes and veils. The earliest legal code to mention clothing, the Code of Hammurabi, actually dictated who could wear what veils, reserved for noble women, slaves forbidden to wear them. Ancient India brought color into the conversation with hand-spun cotton and early silk. People wore sars, dhotis, and turbans, dyed with plant-based pigments like indigo and madder. Their textiles told stories of region, of ritual, of rhythm. The Indus Valley might not have left us volumes of written history, but its tiny terracotta figurines show hairstyles, jewelry, and textiles that speak across time. And then there was China, where silk wasn't just a fabric, it was a revolution. Legend says Empress Lazu discovered it when a silkworm cocoon dropped into her tea. By the time of the Shang dynasty, silk became a state secret, protected as fiercely as gold. Who wore silk? The elite, the rulers, the heavens' favorites. Even this early fashion was never random. It separated kings from servants, priests from commoners, men from women, and sometimes mortals from gods. The shape of a robe, the twist of a belt, the color of a thread. Fashion was language before writing, art before galleries, and long before anyone said, "Look at me." Clothes already had the world's attention in the marble halls of Athens and on the crowded streets of Rome. Fashion became philosophy and a uniform of identity. The ancient Greeks favored balance in all things, in architecture and thought, and in the folds of their garments. Men wore chitons, rectangular linen garments, pinned at the shoulder and belted at the waist. Women draped themselves in peploi or Hamaitian cloaks, graceful folds of fabric that transformed the body into a living sculpture. Sandals, where simple hair was styled with restraint and jewelry, though present, was always in service to harmony. To the Greeks, beauty was moral. Simplicity meant virtue. Ornamentation was fine as long as it didn't shout. But then came Rome, and Rome never whispered. Roman fashion was about spectacle, power, class. Where the Greeks draped, the Romans layered and legislated. The toga, made from a single piece of wool up to 20 feet long, became the ultimate Roman status symbol. Not everyone could wear one, only male Roman citizens, and even then, there were rules. There was the toga virilis for adult men, the toga praetexta with a purple stripe for senators and magistrates, and the toga pictor, embroidered with gold and reserved for emperors and victorious generals. Each type was a costume of authority. Beneath the togas, everyone wore tunics, the t-shirt of the ancient. World simple knee-length for men, ankle-length for women, but even tunics told stories of wealthy. Raman might wear a tunic woven from Egyptian linen or dyed. With rare murex purple, a color so expensive, it was worth more than gold. Women's fashion in Rome was equally coated. The stolor marked a married woman, the pallor a cloak-like shawl. Offered modesty, and movement hair was curled, braided piled high, and sometimes adorned with gold or ivory pins. Fashion wasn't just about beauty. It was a message of fertility, virtue, and social belonging. Even slaves had a fashion rule defined by what they couldn't wear in both. Greece and Rome clothing didn't just protect the body, it displayed your rank, your role, your citizenship. Every fold, every fabric, every color was a declaration. You didn't just wear a toga, you wore the state. While Rome wrapped itself in wool and Greece in linen, Asia was spinning something far more luxurious. Silk, the Silk Road, was more than a trade route. It was a fashion superhighway stretching from China to the Mediterranean. It carried not just goods, but ideas, fabrics, and styles that would shape centuries of dress. At the heart of it all was China, where silk wasn't just an export. It was a symbol of imperial control for centuries. The knowledge of silk production was guarded like a state secret. Only royalty and high-ranking officials were allowed to wear the most refined silks dyed in colors reserved for emperors, like the brilliant Nir. Mythical imperial yellow Chinese robes, especially under the Tang and Han dynasties, were masterpieces of structure and symbolism. Embroidered dragons, phoenixes, and clouds weren't just decoration, they were spiritual markers of rank and destiny. A person's robe said more than a scroll ever could. Further west in India, fashion took a different turn, bold, colorful, and sensually draped. The sari still worn today dates back thousands of years. Woven from fine cotton and silk dyed with indigo and turmeric, saris weren't just beautiful. They were regional fingerprints. A woman's fold, fabric, and border could reveal where she was from her caste, her status. Meanwhile, in Japan, elegance met armor. During the Han period, nobles wore layered silk robes called junahido, their sleeves and collars, revealing carefully coordinated colors, a kind of poetic fashion code. But as the samurai class rose, fashion turned toward function and symbolism, and to the kimono worn by both warriors and commoners. The kimono became a garment of layered meaning, its fabric, weave, and design communicating season, occasion, and even political loyalty. The samurai's kimono was sometimes worn beneath armor, its crest boldly announcing clan allegiance. For geisha and courtiers, kimono sleeves became canvases for art. Asian fashion balanced tradition with refinement, restraint with richness. Every pleat, pattern, and stitch was deliberate, and as fabrics flowed along the Silk Road, Asia quietly taught the world something vital, that clothing wasn't just about protection or pride, it was culture's own. Into skin. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, clothing was not just what you wore, it was who you were. From castle halls to candlelit courts, fashion became a chessboard where every thread was a move and every outfit a declaration of power, virtue, or rebellion. During the Middle Ages, clothing was rigidly tied to class. The poor wore coarse wool and undyed linen. The rich, they turned themselves into walking tapestries. Furlined cloaks, jewel-studded belts, and elaborate braids signaled wealth and piety in equal measure. Dyes were everything. A deep blue meant wealth, a true scarlet reserved for royalty and cardinals. And then came sumptu laws, literal legal codes that dictated what you could or could not wear, based on your social rank. If you dared to wear silk without noble blood, that wasn't a fashion crime, it was an actual crime. In Renaissance Italy, fashion became an art form. Florence and Venice led the way, creating garments so opulent they seemed to defy gravity. Men wore puff sleeves and slashed doublets. Women donned velvet gowns with rigid bodices and embroidered sleeves that whispered stories of family lineage and political power. It was no coincidence that during this time of intellectual rebirth, fashion became intensely theatrical. The more fabric you wore, the less you were expected to work. It was a silent performance of status. Look how much I can afford to waste. Then came the corset, originally worn for posture and modesty. It evolved into a tool of silhouette control, cinching waists, lifting busts, and eventually becoming a symbol of both feminine elegance and restraint. The ideal woman's body became an architectural achievement, and in the grand courts of France and England, fashion reached dizzying new heights, literally with towering wigs, ruffled collars, and dresses that required scaffolding underneath. Women moved like chandeliers, and men just as dramatic, with tights, jewels, codpieces, and shoes that curled like punctuation marks. Fashion was power. A courtier's gown could curry favor or ruin reputations too. Be seen was everything to be seen, incorrectly dangerous in a world of crowns and conspiracies. Clothing was armor, not just against the cold, but against irrelevance. By the 17th century, European fashion had become a spectacle of excess at the French court of Louis. The 14th fashion wasn't just a pastime, it was Policy. Versailles was a stage, and everyone wore a costume. Men strutted in brocade coats with gold embroidery, lace cuffs, silk stockings, and red-heeled shoes, a signature of the king himself, their hair powdered, perfumed, and piled into towering wigs, often adorned with curls, ribbons, and even miniature ships. Women's dresses were architectural wonders. Wide panniers stretched skirts out several feet on each side. Gowns were layered, ruffled, and embroidered within an inch of collapse. The skin was powdered, white cheeks painted red, and beauty spots placed like exclamation points. It was beautiful, ridiculous, and deeply political in a world where wealth meant control. Fashion became a language of elite detachment to the nobility. Clothing was a way to rise above the ordinary to everyone else. It was a reminder of just how far they had fallen. And then came the French Revolution in 1789. The people stormed Versailles, not just the palace, but everything it represented: excess, inequality, silk and satin at the expense of bread. The guillotine didn't just fall on kings, it fell on wigs, heels, corsets. The fashion of the upper class became the uniform of the enemy. Suddenly, simplicity was power. The sans-culotte, or without breeches, proudly rejected aristocratic knee-length trousers. Instead, they wore plain trousers, the clothing of the working class. To wear extravagant clothes during this time wasn't just tone deaf, it was dangerous. In the wake of revolution, fashion itself became democratic. The classical world was idolized. Clean lines, natural fabrics, Greek-inspired gowns, wigs, and heavy makeup vanished almost overnight. Even Napoleon understood clothing as strategy. His military uniform, designed for drama and authority, helped create the image of the strong modern leader his wife Josephine popularized. High-waisted gowns and sheer fabrics that redefined elegance for the Empire era, but the powdered wig had become a relic. Fashion had shifted from flaunting wealth to redefining identity. The revolution didn't just change who ruled France, it changed what people wore to survive it. The 19th century roared in on the hiss of steam engines and the hum of textile looms. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how people worked, it changed how people dress. Suddenly, clothing wasn't reserved for aristocrats, and royalty machines could spin dye and stitch fabric faster than human hands ever could. Mass production meant lower prices, more availability, and for the first time in history, fashion began to trickle down. But even as manufacturing modernized, style remained rooted in spectacle. Women's fashion took on volume, dramatic, sweeping, and almost absurd. The invention of the crinoline, a cage-like steel frame worn beneath skirts, allowed women to wear dresses that ballooned outward like open umbrellas. Some reached 6 feet in diameter, forcing women to move sideways through doors and practically orbit in ballroom circles. The message was clear: if you could wear a dress that prevented work walking or even sitting comfortably. You were probably wealthy enough not to care. Meanwhile, corsets tightened even, further shaping waists into wasp-like proportions. The ideal woman became a fragile hourglass floating on a sea of silk lace until fashion was both a prison and a pedestal for men. Fashion settled into sharp, sober lines, tailcoats, waistcoats, top hats, the uniform of the respectable gentleman. It was during this time that the modern suit began to take form, clean, restrained, professional, dignified with it. Being flashy, but beneath the surface, new trends were stirring department stores, sprang up in cities offering ready-made clothes to a growing middle-class. Fashion magazines like God's Lady's Book and Label Assembly began shaping tastes. And with photography emerging, people could now see what fashion looked like far beyond their village. The rise of the sewing machine in the 1850s brought yet another shift, not just in production, but in personal creativity. Home sewing patterns became popular style, became accessible. Fashion was no longer just for the elite. It was becoming a tool for expression. Even Queen Victoria had an impact, popularizing white wedding dresses, mourning black, and modesty as fashion. In this new industrial world, clothes no longer just reflected identity. They were now building it one stitch at a time. As the 20th century dawned, fashion stood at a crossroads, torn between the corseted elegance of the past and the liberation roaring in with the future. Then came World War I, and everything changed. With men off to battle, women stepped into factories, fields, and offices. The corset, once a daily ritual, became impractical. Even dangerous skirts, shortened fabrics, lightened practicality, became patriotic. Women in uniforms, trousers, and simple tailored coats began to rewrite the definition of femininity. After the war, they weren't ready to go back. The 1920s ushered in a new archetype. The flapper, she wore drop-waist dresses, bobbed her hair, painted her lips red, and danced in speakeasies with a cigarette holder in one hand and rebellion in the other. Her dresses shimmered with fringe and beads. Her knees scandalized society, and her confidence defied generations of restraint. This was fashion as freedom as refusal. Meanwhile, the men of the Jazz Age embraced sharp suits, wide-legged trousers, slicked back hair, and Oxford shoes. Hollywood helped glamorize this image on screen and off. Stars like Greta Garbo and Clark Gable set trends that audiences across the world followed. Then came the crash. The Great Depression of the 1930s forced fashion back toward conservatism. Hemlines dropped, colors dulled, people mended. Instead of buying, style didn't disappear, adapted. Old garments were reworked, flower sacks turned into dresses, and movie stars became style icons of hope amid economic despair. When World War II struck, fashion became a battlefield of its own. Materials were rationed, skirts became shorter, jackets boxier, fabrics stiffer. In the US, the government issued L-85 regulations, dictating how much cloth could be used in civilian clothing. Nylon, once used for stockings, was redirected for parachutes. Women in Europe wore utility clothing, efficient, minimalist, and often uniformic. Men returned to service dress and battle dress, yet out of these limits came innovation. Women wore slacks more frequently, shoulder pads added structure. Fashion designers like Elsa Caparelli introduced surreal elements, thumbing their nose at the austerity in the face of global conflict. Fashion became more than style, it became resilience, a signal to the world that even in chaos, we still choose who we are and what we wear to survive. The world emerged from World War II, battered but hungry for beauty. And in 1947, French designer Christian Dior gave it just that. He called it the new look: cinched waists, full sweeping skirts, soft shoulders, and delicate fabrics. It was a dramatic return to opulence, a celebration of femininity, luxury, and control. For many women, it felt like breathing again after years of rations and uniforms, but not everyone applauded. To some, the new look was a step backward, a return to restrictive ideals after decades of progress. The tension between tradition and transformation would define fashion for decades to come. In The 1950s American suburbia embraced clean-cut style pearls and pencil skirts, gray flannel suits, and everything ironed to perfection, but underneath the polished. Surface rebellion was brewing. Teenagers, a newly defined demographic, began rejecting their parents. Look, they idolized screen rebels like James Dean and Marlon Brando, whose plain white T-shirts, leather jackets, and blue jeans felt raw, honest, and dangerous. And there it was, denim, once a symbol of the American working class. Denim became the uniform of youth rebellion. It wasn't fashion made for you, it was fashion you claimed. Then came the 1960s, and the revolution wasn't just televised, it was worn. London's mod culture gave birth to slim suits, miniskirts, and bold prints. The hippies embraced embroidery. Bell-bottoms and secondhand chic fashion became political, anti-war, anti-establishment, anti-everything that came before. By the 1970s, the lines had blurred. Haute couture still thrived, but streetwear had found its voice. Music drove fashion from disco sequins to punks, torn shirts and safety pins, and through it all, jeans endured, dressed up, distressed, or ripped in protest. Designers like Yves Saint Laurent and Vivienne Westwood understood the shifting tide. Fashion was no longer dictated from the top down. It was now a two-way mirror, reflecting and shaping the world. All at once, clothes were no longer just about class or gender. They were about attitude. Identity resistance. From Dior's silks to Levis's denim, fashion had become something new. Entirely not just what you wore, but who you were. As the 20th century ended, fashion shed its final skin. It stopped asking, what should we wear, and started asking, who are we? The 21st century began with a new energy, one driven by identity, diversity, and the rise of the digital age. Fashion was no longer ruled by seasonal trends whispered in the halls of Paris and Milan. Now it pulsed through Instagram, TikTok, and street corners in Seoul, Nairobi, and New York. Trends were global and instant. A teenager with a smartphone could spark a movement faster than a runway ever could. The rise of fast fashion made style more accessible than ever before. Brands like Zara, H&M, and Forever 21 churned out catwalk-inspired clothes at lightning speed, but it came with a cost: environmental damage, exploitative labor, and a growing awareness of fashion's dark side. In response, sustainability became a new standard. Designers started rethinking materials, waste, and responsibility. Thrift stores surged. Upcycling became cool. Capsule wardrobes and buy less, choose well became mantras. But the real revolution was representation. For decades, fashion favored one body type, one skin tone, one ideal. But now the industry is changing. Designers are casting models of all races, sizes, genders, and abilities. Runways feature hijabs, wheelchairs, vitiligo, and drag, what once existed on the margins now walk center stage. Fashion became a battleground for cultural conversations. Think Black Lives Matter slogans on couture gowns, pride parades with high heels and glitter as protest armor. Indigenous designers reclaiming traditional patterns as a statement of survival. Gender no longer a cage. From androgynous tailoring to skirts on the men's racks, the binary boundaries of fashion began to blur. Icons like Billy Porter, Harry Styles, and Zendaya wore clothes not as statements, but as freedom. And in the metaverse, avatars strut in outfits that can't even exist in real life. Digital fashion, no fabric, no waste, just pixels. And imagination is becoming its own frontier. Fashion now lives everywhere, and it belongs to everyone. What began as linen in ancient Egypt has become a global language, one that can whisper tradition, scream rebellion, or simply say, this is me. Because in the end, fashion isn't just what we wear, it's how we show the world who we are.